What is white privilege? It's almost a thin veil hanging over society, although not as transparent. A well-known essay written by Peggy McIntosh describes white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day. This is not only a story of what it means to be white, this is a story of what it means to be white in a society that is learning how to acknowledge it. Tonight, you'll hear from Kevin Gannon, a white professor who has made it his purpose to inform about white privilege and truth behind American history that has perpetuated the ideas of racial inequity.
We know from biology, from genetics, from history, from sociology, from a vast array of disciplines, that race is not a biological concrete reality. It's something that we create socially and historically to categorize people.
You'll also hear from an interracial couple, the Lewises. Their journey is about trust and learning through the process of what support means in a new realm of cultural realizations in an unwavering movement.
It makes me really sad, being a mother, knowing that they're gonna go through some things that I'm not gonna completely understand and be able to really help them with.
You've always been open about, loving who you love, and you don't see anybody different, which that drew me to you initially. So I think you do have a heart for just all people in general, and then from that you want to meet them where they are.
This is Project Community, Lessons of Love. Bailey and Justin Lewis have been married since 2012. Like every marriage, there have been learning moments. Those moments took on a new meaning after the death of George Floyd on May 25th. Justin Lewis began to intensely stand up for racial injustice and against police brutality, leading marches and events in hopes of making change to societal inequality. Bailey, a worried wife and mom of their 2 kids, started to learn the importance of her support, what it meant to address her privilege, and not only show support as a partner, but what it means to be a white ally.
I don't want to act like I've been woke for so long, because really unfortunately it's been just since pretty much the kids have been born that I've opened my eyes more, which I'm sorry.
Well, no, I mean, you've always been open about, loving who you love, and you don't see anybody different, which that drew me to you initially. So I think you do have a heart for just all people in general, and then from that you want to meet them where they are. So I wouldn't personally be with you if you were any different. I mean, if you were different, essentially. So don't discredit yourself for that. So.
Thank you.
Listening closely. Even on the couch in the home they built together, you can feel the connection built between them on just listening. Both have appreciated the lessons, and this year, days like Loving Day, a day that honors the 1967 court ruling of interracial couples, sinks in deeper. Their family sinks in deeper.
There was that initial awareness of interracial couples being together and the struggles that they go through, living in a divided world that we currently live in. This year, for me personally, I'm more aware of our family's identity, our children's identity as them being biracial. Where will they be at in society and how will they navigate it? And we've discussed specifically on education and where will we send them, whether it be HBCUs so they can be ingrained with their culture,
yes,
and immersed in it so they can get comfortable with their Black side. Because Iowa, a lot of the schools are nearly all white, so we want to just give them an option to see different views of the world. So.
Education, a pivotal part of what it will take to make a change. It's the base of what will make a difference in every society by learning the truth, by learning and recultivating old habits. In a community that's mostly white, education is important. Education would become part of Justin's purpose. Learning would become part of Bailey's.
So we got to the Capitol, and I made it to the steps with a few other people first, and the masses were still coming up, and I just literally started crying, oh my gosh, we did this. Not just me, we as a state, we as a city did this together. So it really was a dream in the sense of that. Now to just kind of educating people and bringing them up to speed and start mobilizing and organizing them to stay locked in, to stay aware of what's going on, and then just use their voices to bring the needed change.
Justin would learn that one of those needed voices would be right there with him on his couch.
I was scared at first. I really, because you saw just what the TV was showing you and what I was hearing from him, and you only hear one side of it. I'm like, honey, you have a wife and kids, you have a family, like, this is scary. So I remember that first night, I was like, okay, good, he came home. And then that second night, I don't know if we were even home or anything, but he's like, hey, I gotta go. The Merle Hay. He's like, I gotta go. I gotta get down. He's like, I don't know. I gotta go. And I was like, okay. Just because the kids and everything, I'm like, I didn't want him to get hurt. Like, but I totally believe in what he's doing and sometimes I feel like I'm not doing enough, but also our kids are so little, and we have had friends and family reach out, which is amazing. I've got to learn to accept the help more. But I feel like part of my helping is just taking care of our family so he can be out there. Mm-hmm. But that's why I'm trying to post more on social media, and I even have a business. And sometimes it's like, try not to be controversial, and it's like, well, in this aspect I'm going to be, because, and I've lost a few friends, or I've had to unfriend a few people because it's just like, I'm sorry.
Because there's always more work to be done. We're always learning, and we always have to remain open to learning and to being teachable, and to not being defensive about it, to understand that even if it feels like as a white person I'm being called out, what I'm really being given is the opportunity to be educated. Mm-hmm. And I need to take that opportunity, even if it's uncomfortable, because as a white person in this country, I can go through my life by default and not really ever be uncomfortable if I don't want to. Mm-hmm. So that's not the case for other people who are not white in this country. And so I think we need to look at it as an equity and as a justice and as a simple human issue.
How do you exist as a white ally in Black spaces if you are your coworker, your friend, your husband who is Black? Like, how do you navigate that?
I think the important thing for white people to realize when we talk about allyship is that in most cases it can't be just about us, right? So if a Black colleague comes to me and narrates their experience about, encountering a microaggression or racism from a student or from a coworker, I can't immediately say, oh, you know what, something happened to me that made me feel just as bad too. Because that's a common tactic that people use, because it shifts the story to being about me, and now I don't have to worry about what other people are going through. It's almost like a psychological defense mechanism. And we have to be very cognizant about that. For me as a white person, I need to be listening. I don't have the personal experience with the consequences of racism in the way that Black and Latinx people do in this country. That doesn't mean that I can't try to understand, to empathize, and to work against it, but that's not my own personal story. So how do I understand in order to address the problem? I have to listen.
I don't see color, or I'm colorblind. And I used to say that too, don't get me wrong. But I'm like, that's not what you should say. Like, every color is beautiful. Everybody's beautiful. We have to see the differences and celebrate them.
Celebrating and understanding personal experiences. That's been Bailey's motivation to learn and empathize with her husband. Not only because he's Black, but because he's Black and existing in many white spaces. A new perspective that's evolved the conversation with Justin and the way that Bailey thinks.
When we first started dating, oh, wow, there's a lot more interracial couples than I thought. But then now it's looking like Iowa, like, wow, it really is white. Like, it's white. In my hometown, there was like 2 Black families in the whole community. And then if there was other ethnicities, like a lot of times from my memory is that they were just adopted into white families. So I didn't grow up with much culture other than my own, or just seeing like Black TV shows or Black movies and stuff, which that's just one little snippet, or that's the stereotype. Mm-hmm. And I was even nervous to date Justin, to be honest, coming from a small town.
Why?
I know I'm kind of going off a little bit.
No, you're fine. Like, why were you nervous? Like, what?
Just because my dad's side is Catholic and just that normal, and they've all been really sweet, and we've had a few little situations, but hopefully we're working through them and we're gonna get through it, because I don't want to break off from my family. I want them to open up and see, but you don't know what you don't know. So I just, through all of this, I just want people to listen. I try really hard on, if I can't talk to you in person, on social media, to be as positive as I can to give you the information, because I don't want you getting mad and then not seeing my point.
A point that is sometimes hard to articulate when white privilege isn't acknowledged. For Bailey, the effort is worth it. It's the definition of white allyship, using your own voice to articulate racial inequity or perspectives of color in society.
I want to keep learning, because I want to keep, so I can inform people that do ask me questions.
So what has happened in white spaces for you? Like, has there been a significant moment where you've been like, oh, is this what I used to, think? Or is this how I used to
Oh, that happens
or-
almost every day.
Really?
To be just, I'm not saying, I don't think I grew up racist, and my parents didn't raise me that way either. I mean, we all have those biases, which I'm not proud of, but yeah, there's just, I don't know how to explain it.
I think you've done a really good job of, because we all have biases, even, African Americans, but, if we're directing it towards what needs to be changed, which is, white biases, you've done a great job, like, throughout our marriage and throughout, knowing me, of, asking questions like, Justin, if I see this and I'm feeling this way, why is it wrong? And, you attack those head on. And that's what makes me most proud about being with you and, starting a family with you. And then, I know we're going to be able to raise our children to be good citizens in the world and view everybody as, people. And then, informing people as we go forward. So, I mean, yeah, I guess you do a good job.
Thanks. I guess the biggest thing I try to do is, and what we've talked about, is like, if you have to question it, then don't say it.
Yeah, like, so what is something that you were like, I didn't know, so I asked, and then I got the answer, but it was a moment of, like, evolution again. Like, you had to evolve your way of thinking, like, you didn't know it was wrong.
So the biggest one that really hits me, and it, like, almost makes me want to cry every time I think about it, is we were in our apartment. Justin wasn't even there. It was with my quote-unquote stepsister and her husband, and they're white, and I said, Justin's the whitest black guy I know. And I used to be one of those, like, joking, haha, but now I'm really trying to get that role. If you wouldn't say that in front of the person, then don't say it at all. So kind of like, if you have nothing nice to say, don't say it. And it didn't hit me till later, like, that was horrible. Like, why did I say that? Like I said, it makes me want to. But I can't believe I was that insensitive. But I also want people to know, like, if you say those things, like, you can change. You can choose to change, and you can. Because that's, like, really embarrassing to me. But I also want people to, it's.
Work through.
I just feel bad because, like he said, he's had identity crisis issues and stuff. And for me to say that, and I'm his wife, like, how insensitive and how hurtful. So that one sticks with me, like, every day. Like, I wish I never would have said it.
So it varies by situation, I think,
Yeah.
but I think one of the most important things that we need to keep in mind, and by we, I mean white people, is that when we are in white-only spaces a lot. If you're white in this country, you can be around people who look and feel and act like you all the time by default. And so what's happening in those whites-only spaces? Because if you're not doing the work there, then you're not really doing the work, right? So if I'm in a group of white people and someone says something racist or makes a racist joke, or says something that I think perpetuates sort of a harmful stereotype or something that's actually doing harm to a person. So if a bunch of teachers are talking about an African American student and saying, well, where they come from, they don't really value education. Like, am I going to let that go by?
Right.
Or am I going to say something and intervene? When white people hear the phrase Black Lives Matter, If your first reaction is to see that as an attack, you need to sit with that and think about why that is. Why is your first reaction to see someone saying Black Lives Matter is a personal attack against whites? Because that is not, Black Lives Matter. Those are the three words. It doesn't say Black Lives Matter more. It doesn't say Black Lives Matter and y'all's don't. It says Black Lives Matter. And so a white person who sees this as saying Black Lives Matter but white people don't, you are adding words, you are adding context, you are adding things that are not there. And so you need to sit with that and think about, why is that where I'm investing my energy right now? Why am I not listening to this message? And why am I turning it into an attack? There's an old saying that says, when you're accustomed to privilege, even the suggestion of equality feels like oppression. And I would argue that that's the phenomenon that we're seeing here, right? So when someone's response to Black Lives Matter is all lives matter, that's an attempt to dodge the issue. Of course all lives matter, including Black lives. By that logic, I could go into the children's cancer ward at blank pediatric hospital or blank children's hospital and say, yes, cancer is awful, but all diseases are awful. And yes, it's awful that children have cancer, but you know what? Other people have cancer too, and have you all really thought about them? Because that's what that all lives matter argument is. Would you do that? If my house is on fire and every other house on the street is okay and the fire department shows up and they hook the hose up to the hydrant and then they start hosing down the other houses first, and I say, excuse me, my house is on fire, and the fireman turns to me and says, well, all houses matter. All property is important. That's the all lives matter argument. We're not saying that all lives don't matter. We are saying that for much of this country's history, the actions, the laws, the circumstances, the structures of inequality that have defined this society have said Black lives do not matter. And this Black Lives Matter movement is an assertion that no, Black lives do matter.
The chant, Black Lives Matter! The sign, the hashtag is a fight for justice. Listening and humanizing the people that hold it is necessary for new chapters in the progress for racial equity. It's not your one Black friend that seems okay because you didn't take the time to understand what they needed. It's about Black people learning how they can evolve in a society that is systematically and consciously putting them down. With no other excuse, then that's what they were taught to do.
You can't just have, like Justin said this a lot and it's true, you can't just have like one token Black friend. You can't just have one token Black family member. Like, you've got to see it all, because...
And then they'll use you as like, well, I'm not racist or I don't have any biases because, I know Justin. And I'm like, no, it doesn't work like that. Like,
it doesn't.
Have we had an actual deep conversation? Have I told you about how I feel about policing, how I've been harassed, how I have guns pulled on me? Have I told you about, the things my grandmother's seen? No, because I don't feel comfortable. So if you don't know those deep, traumatic things and events that I know and live through, you can't empathize and see and feel my experience of America compared to yours.
An experience that has cultivated a purpose and a fight that wouldn't exist if racial inequality didn't. While most Black people understand that a truth should exist with the phrase all lives matter, the empathy hasn't been reciprocated to the understanding of the treatment of Black people in this country. All lives matter is not the opposite of Black Lives Matter.
The people that say that, in my opinion, must not have a very diverse group of friends or family, because I don't think you would say that if you did, because you would realize that you go to Gordman's and you're shopping with your husband who's Black and he's getting followed to go through. I'm in another part of the store, but he tells me about it later that he's like, they had a pair of socks, but they were following me and just watching me. And I'm like, you can choose to see what you want to see. And I don't know. I can see that he gets treated different. We've been at restaurants and I get the bill and not him. Like, thankfully, I haven't seen a huge amount, and I can be naive sometimes. So I try to just stay in our little bubble. So I'm sure there could be even more things happening around me, but I'm like, whatever, I'm going to sit here and enjoy my moment with my family. But I know, they've handed me the bill before, which, don't you think out of, respect, it should be, either placed in the middle or given to the man? I don't know. That's a little old-fashioned on my part, but, but the all white, they don't see the oppression, I guess is the gist of it. Mm-hmm. They don't see it. They don't see, like Justin had to cut his hair to get a job like 5 years ago. He had dreads down to the middle of his back, but he couldn't get a few of the jobs because of his hair. Like, come on, like, really? And like, I don't know. It's so frustrating to me for people to not see that.
And there is a difference. It's been reaffirmed through Bailey's Lens and many others that in America, it is a privilege to be white.
So we know that Black Lives Matter in this household. And we address people that, say all lives matter by, speaking truth, telling, sharing stories. And then it's up to them if they want to empathize and understand. We know in America that all lives don't matter, sadly, because we see African Americans and, our Native Americans. We see women being mistreated, underpaid. So, the sentiment of all lives matters is really just a baseless argument that is used to, quell dissent, to quell any other varying experiences that people are facing.
It's just a saying. It's not an actual action.
Yeah, there's nothing behind all lives matter.
No.
It sadly just needs to stop being used. And people just need to wake up, shut up, and listen for a few minutes.
They don't matter more, they don't matter less, they don't matter to the exclusion of other lives, but we have done, as a country, as a society, a super poor job demonstrating that Black Lives Matter. And if you're not willing to sort of think about that truth, and if you're not willing to sit with that, then there's work to be done.
I would say when I'm trying to explain it, if I can, I say that I already fear for my unborn child. Like walking down the street or going to the store or like doing anything like that. Like I feel like even now I already feel worried.
Right.
And I feel like it's not the same for a white parent or anyone else. They don't have the same worry if their child gets pulled over.
No. And as a kid, I did my fair share of juvenile delinquency. I came home, when I was in high school, I came home in the back of a police car several times. I've been picked up for petty vandalism and things like that, and for other I don't have a criminal record. None of that ever made it on paper.
Wow.
Would that have been the case if I was not a white male living in the suburbs? I don't think so.
And we have, 2 interracial children, and they're going to have to navigate society on, where do I fit in, if it's my white side of my family or my black side of the family. But I wanted to give them a strong sense of, America's going to see you guys as black, and this is what you need to prepare yourself for. Mm-hmm. Ezekiel is a lot lighter, and he's probably going to be able to pass as a white male, which kind of gives us some comfort, which is sad because when it comes to policing, he can immediately be pulled over and seen as a black male and be a target and threatening. And it sucks that we have to think about that about our son. It's terrible. But we're going to explain to him about the privilege of his lighter skin, and we're going to explain to him about how to use that and be able to strengthen the black community with that. And then we have a beautiful girl named Eden, who is a little bit darker, and she's a lot like her dad, energetic. And we're just going to tell her about, what black women have faced in this country, be very intentional about preparing her for the world that she lives in. And we're going to have her make sure she's very outspoken and she's not going to be a fear of men or of white women and white feminism, sadly, and be strong. So I think that's how we're going to raise our kids. We're going to be very intentional.
The lessons of love and first. Stories and experiences with their kid will be a world of duality because of the color of their skin. The first moments of joy and challenges will be through their little girl, Eden.
She has started noticing the color difference, though, already, because you're learning your colors. and realizing that mommy's more like Peach. We've just within the last week or two, Mommy, you're Peach and Daddy's brown, I'm brown, and Ezekiel's brown. I'm like, yeah, baby, but I also like, I don't want to make it a negative thing. Like I am like, but to kind of talk about how the kids in that aspect, it makes me really sad, being a mother, knowing that they're going to go through some things that I'm not going to completely understand and be able to like really help them with. They're going to go through things and I'm not going to understand, or I'm not like Justin can, like I'm their mom. I should be able to be there for them for anything. And I will, I'll hold them. I will try my hardest, but just to know that they are going to go through some of that, and that they are even going to have to go through some of that.
The idea haunts Bailey, but she also knows that there is power in being a white mother to her brown kids.
Me going in there, me going into the school, or me going into an organization and be upset, they're going to see me as the aggressive black guy. And, I have the right to be upset because my babies are being mistreated. But you can go in there and be the upset Karen and get some stuff moving.
Well, I hope not, Karen.
So, well, no, they're saying Karen's for
I know,
Karen's against injustices. So I think if we utilize that going forward, and we can get some change. And I think it's important for the country to see interracials having these discussions, because really we are a representation of what this country is. It's a divide between white and black, and a disconnect between white and black. And if we can do it, the country can do it.
Yeah.
Again, not listening with the intent to respond, but listening with the intent to listen. Not listening with, okay, what's the bare minimum I can do to get these people to shut up, but why are these people advocating for reforms that I see as radical, and why do I see them as radical? Why do I not see them as common sense solutions? A lot of the reforms that are associated with the prison abolition movement, for example, are extraordinarily sensible in a fiscal sense, for example. Why are we not thinking about that? So those, we need to be asking ourselves and those who are representing us and holding positions of power in our community to be more accountable, to actually pursue something beyond just cosmetic change, because we know what will happen if we just do nothing or cosmetic change. We're going to be doing all this again in another year. We know that will happen. So the question is, do we have the wherewithal, do we have the moral courage, do we have the political will to actually make changes? That's the question. And so our answer to that is going to really, I think, define where not only our city, our community goes, but where our state and our nation go too. So to use the teaching metaphor, I can't teach students who don't come to class. I can't teach a student who's sleeping through class. So if somebody's in a conversation where it could be a teaching and learning experience and that person has completely shut off to the learning process, I can't really do anything. I'm powerless to stop that. But I think the conversation needs to be had, because so many of us in the United States, we have this sort of larger mythos of individuality, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing. And that, people who are poor because of some personal failing, or, I don't see color, so, I judge everybody individually. But it doesn't work like that. We are dependent upon one another, we interact with one another, we are all connected. And that's a lot harder to think about, because then you have to think about the stuff that doesn't make you feel as good if you're a white person. And you have to think about, well, I may not have personally participated in this, but I am complicit in a system that dehumanizes people who don't look like me.
I mean, not that we don't have bumps,
Oh,
but
yeah,
you have to talk
bumps.
about it. But the main,
Speed bumps.
you talk about Justin being a leader in the community, I don't like being in the forefront. I almost didn't want to do this interview because I like being behind the scenes and doing all that. But I realized that my voice is needed in this movement. So that is why I took the day off and wanted to be here and do this, even though it scares the crap out of me, makes me nervous. But he has told me that my voice is heard more than his. Because to a lot of people, he's just whining and crying and it's just la da da, but that more people will listen to me.
Yep.
So that's why I made it so important. And that's one reason, like, I'm wearing this shirt. I've got like 8 or 9 shirts that I bought after all this happened that I guess I know it's just a shirt and it's not changing anything, but I'm hoping that people read it and then they see where I stand. And then if they want to talk about it, I'll talk about it. But so I've got other shirts too that I wear that I guess I kind of in a sense want to be a little bit of a walking billboard to start the conversation and to let them know where I stand. And because I have a husband and 2 kids, an extended family that they need me. So it's scary for me in the front. Normally I like to be in the back, but here I am, trying.
That's the first step, showing up. So Bailey shows up on social media to educate. Justin shows up to protest for change. Change that he believes should happen in policy, education, and how the world will view their children. A change from fear into hope, so that one day they won't have to worry if their kids will return home. One day they won't have to worry that there are systems in place built on the history of America to keep them down. The thought of their kids not returning home because the color of their skin alone can potentially put them in danger is enough to fuel Justin's passion every day.
And they can have a sense of peace when our sons will leave and go to and from their jobs and to school, that our children will come back home, you know. So it's not just you guys returning home. Will our family return home? And that, I think that's very important. You guys have been told to protect and serve us. Do it. Because I want my black son to come home. Mm-hmm. I want my black daughter to come home. So we'll flip it on its head. My family's not a threat.
I feel like
99% of this community is not a threat. And we can say it for the white community. 99% of the community is not a threat. We don't hate cops. We want to live our life in autonomy. We want to be able to generate wealth for the generations to come. And that can't be done when we're removing sons and daughters and fathers and mothers out of the household.
I think too it starts to, you know, if you're kind of on that note, the whole defunding the police thing, like, it starts with education, starts young. Like, our teachers are not getting paid enough. Do you know how hard their job is? And if we put more funding into education and teach the proper curriculum, like, get that history in there, like, you wouldn't have the biases already being instilled in preschool or kindergarten. Like, we would be building it up, just like we want to start foreign languages at a younger age. Well, let's start history at a younger age.
Recently, more educators have acknowledged that in schools, American history highlights the accomplishments of mostly white men who are given the most opportunity. What's missing is the backbone, the people who built this country as slaves, the direct results of socioeconomic oppression from systems like redlining, the definition of systemic racism and its foundation, the interrupted movements that happen along the way for America's progress. What is illustrated instead is the perpetuated idea that white is safe, good, and even heroic, cultivating a pattern of assumptions. It's more than coincidence that 44 of our 45 presidents were all white.
Well, a lot of it is you start with the actual historical record. And a lot of times, you know, when we do history, and, you know, I know my own experience in K-12 history, for example, I had great teachers, but it was a curriculum that didn't challenge us as students to really engage with, you know, something more than just kind of a sanitized Hallmark card version of U.S. history, where, you know, there's great men and they're heroes, and then everybody else eventually gets equal too. But history is messier than that. You know, history is not the story of uninterrupted progress. History is a story of, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, et cetera, right? And, you know, I think one of the things that history shows us today that I think is very relevant for our moment is if you look at the major gains in terms of equality, civil rights, you know, voting rights, any of these sorts of things, they were not accomplished peacefully. They were not accomplished without protest. And so for folks today saying, well, you don't need to protest, you can work within the system, the historical record shows us that has never worked. And so what you have is you have this sort of ironic invocation today of critics of the protest saying, well, Martin Luther King Jr. was peaceful and nonviolent, and he wouldn't have approved of all of what's happening in these protests. Well, first, you need to read some Martin Luther King Jr.
Yep.
But second, what do you think that the civil rights activists were doing in the 50s and 60s? You know, they weren't just singing, you know, sitting in a circle singing, "We shall overcome." They were marching. They were protesting. And in fact, the nonviolent strategy of King invited violence and retaliation from the white community. There was violence. And in fact, we see that today, that more of the violence that we see with the protests in the wake of the George Floyd killing is violence visited upon protesters and activists by law enforcement. So what is the system that created the circumstances where a white police officer could kneel on the neck of George Floyd for over 9 minutes while he said over 20 times that he couldn't breathe until he died? What is the system that is allowed to occur in? Because George Floyd, as we know, is not the only example of this. Tragically, we know this very well. Yet each time there are a lot of people, most of them white, who are willing to look at this as an isolated incident, as a bad apple, and we get in this trap then of only talking about symbolic changes. And so you have police officers taking a knee and now everything's supposed to be better. No. If my house is rotten at the foundation, I'm not going to put a new coat of paint on it and think that I fixed it. I need to knock it down to the slab and start over.
In the beginning, I told you about Peggy McIntosh, the woman who authored a well-known essay on white privilege and wrote it back in 1988. Peggy's words and perspective are used by scholars today. Not only does she acknowledge unconscious and deliberate oppression against people of color, she clearly displays her journey of realizations, learning that white privilege isn't taught to be acknowledged, while also understanding the benefits of her own whiteness.
What I study is what happens above the hypothetical line of social justice. And in school, I was never taught to even notice this realm. Above the hypothetical line, one can be pushed up, believed, thought worthy of responsibility, considered to be responsible with money, considered to be capable of doing the schoolwork or any other kind of work. One can be seen as representative of the best. That's privilege. Above the hypothetical line of justice, one has more than one deserved because of circumstances of birth and other people's positive projections onto one. And below it is disadvantage. That is unearned disadvantage. And I believe everybody in this room has a combination of both experiences.
She boils down much of this perspective to what she placed into 50 points and names the daily effects of white privilege. She writes, "After I realized the extent to which men work from a base of unacknowledged privilege, I understood that much of their oppressiveness was unconscious. Then I remembered the frequent charges from women of color that white women whom they encounter are oppressive. I began to understand why we are seen as oppressive even when we don't see ourselves that way. I began to count the ways in which I enjoyed unearned skin privilege and have been conditioned into oblivion about its existence." After the interview was over, the Lewises and I talked about McIntosh's essay. I read only a few of her 50 points on the daily effects of white privilege. The two quickly realized we hit a lot of these points. But here's some of what she said, so tell me if you agree or feel. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I can't avoid spending time with people whom I'm trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust my kind or me. If I should need to move, I'm pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and which I want to live. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. We're just talking about that. Mm-hmm. I can turn on the television or be open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. When I am told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. Mm-hmm. We talked about that too. I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. If I want to, I can be pretty sure of finding a publisher for this piece on white privilege, which she did. I can be pretty sure of having my voice heard in a group in which I am the only member of my race. I can be casual about whether or not to listen to another person's voice in a group in which he is the only member of her race. It goes on, there's like 50, but I mean, even those, like the first 5 or 6, we just talked about them.
Every single one.
Yeah. If a
The
traffic
history
cop,
testifying to your existence.
yeah, yeah.
I think that's the craziest one.
And this wasn't written that long ago. This was
No.
1988. Her perspective continues. Number 15. I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own daily physical protection. 20. I can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race. Number 30. If I declare there is a racial issue at hand or there isn't a racial issue at hand, my race will lend me more credibility for either position than a person of color will have. Number 32. My culture gives me little fear about ignoring the perspectives and powers of people of other races.
I don't want to act like I've been woke for so long.
And a voice for African Americans, but also bring the nation together.
If you wouldn't say that in front of the person, then don't say it at all.
My family's not a threat.
Like, I almost didn't want to do this interview because I like being behind the scenes and doing all that, but I realized that my voice is needed in this movement.
White privilege is something that I think is both easy to define, but also very hard to define because it involves so much kind of emotional and identity-related baggage for people, whether they're white or not. And I think sort of the way that sociologists and others and historians would define it is white privilege is sort of the unearned benefits, the power of accumulated power that white people have in society. But I think that makes many white people defensive because it's interpreted as a personal attack by someone saying, well, I didn't have privilege, I grew up poor, I worked hard, I grew up on the farm, whatever. So I think as a historian, an easier and more productive way to think about it is for white people in this country, historically speaking, even if individually they had things hard or things were difficult, that the color of their skin did not make it more difficult.
Right.
And I think that's a way for us all to look at this idea of white privilege and understand that it reflects larger structures of inequality that have been developed over centuries in this country.
I'll leave you with one more quote from Peggy McIntosh. In proportion, as my racial group was being made confident, comfortable, and oblivious, other groups were likely being made unconfident, uncomfortable, and alienated. Whiteness protected me from many kinds of hostility, distress, and violence, which I was being subtly trained to visit in turn upon people of color. Bailey Lewis said that at first she didn't want to do this interview. She did it because she felt her words, her understanding, her journey of evolving was necessary to convey, so maybe that more people would listen. That in itself is a full understanding of her privilege and one of the many ways she fights for the equity of her husband and kids. Whiteness equals protection. We have to start acknowledging the differences to change them. My fear of getting pulled over when I'm not dressed like this, or the fears I have for my future kids' experiences are not an illusion. They are sentiments that echo entire communities. It may take time to educate yourself, call yourself out, or step outside your own reality, but all of it is necessary. We can all learn from each other like the Lewises do every day. For Project Community, I'm Rhea Spigner. Thank you for watching and listening.